Hello and welcome, lovely listeners, to another episode of The Best Games Period. This is episode 57. I am Jack Gardner, your host, and with me today is the ever lovely and wonderful Jeremy Brown. Say hello, Jeremy.
Hello, Jeremy.
Close enough. And also with us this week is not Daniel Jones. Instead, we have a different Dan Olson from Folding Ideas on YouTube.
Hey, everybody.
Probably a better Dan. I'm just gonna say.
We got an upgrade.
All Dans are equal in the eyes of the Lord.
I mean, have you ever met the other Dan?
I've met a lot of Dans.
I'm teasing.
A lot of Dans.
We like to give Dan a hard time. Daniel, actually.
Our Daniel is like the Black Waltz 3 of Daniels.
Timely reference.
He crashes and burns, but he shows back up somehow.
So Dan, you are a YouTube guy. You do Twitch. I've seen you do a whole bunch of things. Tell our listeners.
Yeah, I do a lot of things. So in my day job, I'm a filmmaker, film editor out of Calgary, Alberta. Mostly a lot of corporate stuff, commercial stuff, but I also work on features and independent films, and I make my own stuff, and then I have a background in education, and that's actually where I kind of first got involved with YouTube. I had a number of courses that I was looking to adapt into video form, and I wound up leaving that job shortly after I kind of cooked up this idea, but I thought it was a really good idea. So I'm like, okay, well, I'll just go ahead and do it myself for a YouTube channel. And that's kind of where it started. And yeah, I just kind of kept with it because it's a good way to build skills and keep yourself sharp, and it's a great place to kind of experiment with a bunch of different stuff. I kept at it and eventually kind of found a modicum of success in that sphere. So it's a good kind of add-on to everything else I do, and I really like it. I've had a long-standing kind of interest in new media and online media, online delivery, YouTube and stuff like that. I think it's going to be it's going to continue to be a fairly core part of media going forward.
You typically, on your YouTube channel, you tend to talk about both film and gaming subjects, and also you make use of puppets.
Yeah, so okay, so there's a couple, I guess, a couple different things in there. The main sort of thing with subject matter. So we'll address that first. So that with approaching movies, television, video games, all of it, really what I'm looking at, like what the channel is looking at, is visual media and narrative media. It ends up being visual media just kind of by virtue of being a video series. So you do want to kind of focus on the visual stuff. I have done non-visual media in the past, but principally visual. So we're talking about narrative media and storytelling and the mechanisms of storytelling and the mechanisms of language and communications and how all of these different things interact with each other. So it's kind of multidisciplinary in that regard, that it's like, okay, let's look at, communications theories. Like, let's look at something like semiotics, and then how does semiotics interface with storytelling? So with that, it's a great way to kind of drift between mediums, and also it's a good excuse to compare and contrast mediums. Like, okay, how do narrative techniques in film maybe fall flat in a video game, and vice versa?
Did you see the puppets as kind of a way of making those topics more digestible?
Well, sort of. So the puppets actually started. So I originally, actually way back when. So the first video I did was just kind of normal vlog style, like me sitting in front of the camera, sitting in front of my webcam, reading the script off of the laptop screen, and it was pretty terrible. It's actually on the channel. You can see it. It's called Episode 01 Memes, and that's from back in 2010. So that's 7 years old now.
Dang.
And I just, watching it, I have, training in presentation and filmmaking, but I didn't have the tools at the time. Like, I just had a webcam was all I had. A webcam was kind of all I could afford at the time, and I really just sort of grabbed onto the idea of, like, you know what, the best tool in the world is the one that you've got.
Yep.
So I just kind of went with it, and the puppet wound up being a way to sort of work with those limitations, because I didn't like the obviousness of me reading off the screen, but at the same time I really wanted to do these presentations that were a little bit more intricate, that, like, you know, were really more essay-ish. You know, they're very constructed and intentionally constructed, and with that, it was like I couldn't memorize these long, complicated scripts, and reading them in chunks in a way that was like I would just kind of do a chunk at a time. That it's like, okay, today we're going to the mall. Today we're going to the mall. Put the script down. Look at the camera. Today we're going to the mall. And it just, and you know, you can use that process, but it takes forever. Like, it's a really, really slow way of doing it. Also, with that, Blip.tv was a now defunct site that...
Rest in peace.
Yeah, R.I.P. Blip. That drew in a lot of people in that specific realm who were doing, like, serial content. So they weren't just a channel. They weren't just like a personality vlogger. They were intentionally trying to do a more TV style format. So it was people who was like, yeah, I want to have a thing. It's the same kind of subject and structure every single installment. You've got an intro, you've got credits. You know, just kind of using a lot more of the dialect of television in order to present their stuff. And out of that environment, I kind of needed a gimmick. Like, it sounds bad to say a gimmick, but it's like you need a gimmick. You need something to kind of help yourself stand out. And the puppet wound up being a really good merger between sort of a visual gimmick, a show gimmick, and it also let me just present by reading right off the script, because, you know, I'm not on camera, I'm below camera, and so I can just have the script in front of me, and I can just, you know, practice it until I can present it while reading in a fairly fluid and acceptable way. And so it wound up being a good compromise between those. But then with the move back to YouTube, with the demise of Blip, YouTube's just a different environment. You need a kind of different dialect. People respond better to a human face. So the puppets have kind of gone back to a supporting role.
Okay. I had to ask just because our other Dan also, for a while, did YouTube puppet shows with a emphasis on talking about gaming stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I know he would kill me if I didn't ask you about your puppet stuff.
Yeah, I still really like it. I just, in the same way there were a lot of reasons why I initially started using the puppet, there was also a lot of reasons why I didn't use it, and part of it was that it wasn't dialectically appropriate, and also I suffered an injury that fall that made it really difficult to use the puppet for long periods of time. So it was like,
okay.
it was a synthesis. It was a coincidence of factors, and yeah.
All right. Well, speaking of synthesis, you nominated Final Fantasy IX as this week's topic.
I did. I'm sorry.
Why are you sorry? What
I don't
made
know.
you nominate this game?
I feel like I should apologize for that, and I don't know why. Because Final Fantasy IX, I think, is a very interesting game, but also a very strange game to talk about in terms of it being a great game.
Okay. It's interesting. But you nominated it, nonetheless.
I did nominate it.
Okay.
I did nominate it.
So, what is special about it that it earned your nomination? We'll just start there.
So, Final Fantasy IX, I think, it really is kind of an intensely interesting game to talk about, because there's a lot of history behind it. There's a lot of interesting, kind of facts about its development. The end product is, it's kind of unique in Final Fantasy history in a lot of ways, that it was, it did come out during the heyday of Final Fantasy. When Final Fantasy was seen as a very consistent product, it was a consistently hyped product. Everybody was looking forward to things. Every installment that was coming out was was selling very well. Like it was always a commercial success by the standards of the time, and in fact several of them were even record setters by the standards of the time. But Final Fantasy IX in a lot of ways has just kind of drifted out of the public consciousness, especially compared to the games that kind of immediately surround it. 7, like, so 6 and 7 have massive legacy in terms of, like, not just people who played them, but people who have then gone back over and over and over again to revisit them and sing their praises, and just, like, gobs and gobs of fan art. Final Fantasy VIII has a little bit more storied of a history, in that people remember it, but they often don't remember it kindly.
It's odd in that people remember Final Fantasy VIII quite often, but it's not for good reasons.
Yeah.
But you see it referenced much more often than Final Fantasy IX.
In my experience, it seems like people either love 8 and don't like 9, or vice versa.
Yeah, I'd say I've noticed that as well.
So 8 has, I think, just because of the sort of the controversial nature of 8, like, that it is kind of a love it or hate it. Like, a lot of people have gone back to revisit it and said some very unkind things about it, because don't get me, like, 8 is a very weird game, and there's a lot of really strange stuff about it, and a lot of systems that they tried out in 8 that just really did not hold up with time. So it's kind of it is a fun one to revisit for a lot of people, because there are so many of these decisions that, like, even within the scope of Final Fantasy, like, they dropped right away and did not come back to.
Well, no other RPG went with those systems either.
And no other RPG went there either. Like, the draw system there are thousands of hours on YouTube complaining about the draw system, and for a lot of kind of rightly so. And with that, contentiousness, 8 also gets a very passionate defense from a lot of people, like, particularly for people where it was like it was their first one, and then on the other side of 9, you have Final Fantasy X, which for a huge chunk of the current, like, Final Fantasy fan base, that really was their first entry into it. That was the first PS2 one, and history lesson, like, if you look at the install base of the PS2, like, up until, I want to say it was, like, up until the DS, and the DS eventually passed the PS2 in install base after the DS had been out for, like, 6 years, and the Wii eventually surpassed the PS2's install base. But so the PlayStation 2 is, I would want to confirm these numbers, but I think in the ranking it is still, like, the third best selling console of all time by some, like, huge margin. So it's like you've got this little cluster of the DS, the Wii, the PS2, huge gap down to number 4, which I think is the PS3.
Well, yeah, I mean, the PlayStation 2, and I guess we're getting a little bit off topic here, but the PlayStation 2 had both one of the longest console lifespans, like, well into the PlayStation 3 era, it was still selling relatively well. And on top of it, you had Final Fantasy X, which I would argue firmly established it as the platform for the modern RPG. Like, if you wanted to make a modern RPG, you did it on the PlayStation 2.
Yeah, it was the erudite console. It was the prestige console. You had the Xbox, which had its reputation as the frat
Halo box
console, like the Halo box. It was the Halo box. And then the GameCube, which was the Double Dash box. Like, let's be honest here. The Smash Bros box. And
Party box.
The party box. So you had the party box, you had the frat box, and then the PlayStation 2, which, I mean, and the thing is so many people got it because it was actually, like, the most cost-effective DVD player on the market for a really long time. And so hence just the massive install base. And so from that, like, Final Fantasy X dovetailed into that so well. And so there's just so many people who their first real exposure to Final Fantasy was Final Fantasy X. And it's also stuck in the memory for a lot. Like, if we're honest about it, 10 is a really good entry point into JRPGs as a whole. Like, it's mechanically quite smooth. The difficulty curve is very forgiving. The story and characters are memorable, even if some of those memorable parts are a little on the cringy side in retrospect.
Ha 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 ha!
Exactly. And 9 is kind of sandwiched in between these, and so it ends up being weird because it does not have the detractors that 7, 8, and 10 have. 7, 8, and 10 have people who are more than willing to just get up and pillory those games for their various respective failings. 9 doesn't really have any exceptional failings. It also, in a weird way, doesn't have any like super exceptional peaks either. And this is part of what makes it really notable, actually. Yeah,
and one of the things that I think a lot of people in retrospect tend to forget is that Final Fantasy IX was the swan song of the PlayStation 1 era. Because, like a year later, Final Fantasy X came out.
It actually came out, so Final Fantasy IX came out 8 months after the PS2 launch.
Yeah. So you had Final Fantasy IX coming out in 2000 in November of 2000 in North America, and then a little over a year later, December 2001, Final Fantasy X comes out.
Yeah.
And it just, because it's just on a completely new console, it's presentation-wise and visually, and has voice acting, it has all these things that can be crammed onto this PlayStation 2 disc.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a case where, like, production value alone, it completely overshadowed Final Fantasy IX.
And the thing to keep in mind, like, Final Fantasy IX sold really well. Like, it was a commercial hit. It did really, really well. In fact, it did better than you would ever expect for a game. Like, nowadays, if a game came out, like, if a PS3 game had come out 8 months after the PS4 launch and, and still hit, like, top 10 bestseller, like, if it hit number 1 for that weekend, like, we would be like, holy crap, what is going on? I mean, and part of that is also that nowadays, like, every game comes out on everything. So, like, so this wasn't exclusive. Yeah. It was a console exclusive. It was just on the PS2, and it still sold, like, it sold really well, especially leading into the holidays. And then people just kind of quickly forgot about it. And I think a lot of that was that, after the holidays, like, a lot more households now had a PS2, like, because that November, December was, like, huge for the install base of the PS2. It sold amazingly well. And then with Final Fantasy X coming so hot on the heels, there really wasn't that time for the community to really digest 9. There wasn't that time, that wait period for the next game where they get kind of, where you actually do 2 or 3 replays, annual replays, and you're sitting there like, well, I like Final Fantasy IX, but I don't really feel like playing it. I'm going to go sit online and I'm going to do some fan art for it. And 10 was so hot on its heels that 9 just kind of just wafted away in a lot of ways.
At least in terms of the impact maybe it had on people's memory of the series.
Yeah, the traction, the cultural traction of it.
There's where you took your note.
There's where I took out. Yeah, I took that note earlier. I wanted to talk about traction. I wanted to talk about the cultural traction of FF9, and that's sort of what that was. It didn't get that traction, and I think a lot of people have gone, like, certainly these days a lot more people are going back and revisiting 9, because I think with 15 coming out, Final Fantasy is kind of on people's minds, and I think people have gotten over sort of the seething resentment that had sort of bred in with 13 in a lot of ways. And people are kind of going, it's like, hey, let's actually sort of take a look at our communal relationship with Final Fantasy as a whole. And that's, of course, enabled by the fact that the 7 remake is coming out in 2035, and
assuming it's even coming out.
And Square has also been sort of facilitating this by like releasing basically every other title that they've made on every platform that they can get them onto.
Yeah. So
well,
what?
and actually, since we're still kind of on the subject of the history of Final Fantasy IX's release, one of the things that I do want to point out, and this goes into sort of that traction and the production value note that you brought up in particular, is that Final Fantasy IX was originally intended to have a PS2 release and a PC release. In
Really?
fact, they planned for it. During production, they planned that Final Fantasy IX was going to be forward ported onto the PS2, and it was going to be ported onto the PC, because Final Fantasy VII, a few years earlier, in, I want to say it was 97 or 98, Final Fantasy VII got a PC port, and it was really well received. It was buggy. There were a lot of bugs, but it looked fantastic. Mm-hmm. It looked way better than the PlayStation version, and it sold really well, and a lot of people liked it. And they brought in a whole new bunch of people to Final Fantasy who hadn't been able to access it because it wasn't on PC and they didn't own consoles. Then the Final Fantasy VIII PC port came out, and it was garbage. It was awful. It had so many just like graphical glitches and just weird compatibility glitches that it got savaged in the reviews. So that threw kind of a wet blanket onto that. And then with Final Fantasy X's development being so close behind, sort of a lot of factors colluded to have this Final Fantasy IX port sort of just canned. But they had been intending to do it, and so all of the assets in Final Fantasy IX were originally done to a level that we would today consider to be like just below HD. Actually, really, it was HD. Like if you, it would have been fine for the PS3, like 720. 720 was essentially what they had planned for as their resolution. And, so all of the art assets were made to that level, and the character complexity was to that level. And, that's
so why did they cancel it?
Why did they cancel it? I think the overlap of all of these different things, the harsh reviews for the Final Fantasy VIII port and the impending release of Final Fantasy X, which even if they had, because it was going to take almost another year in order to get the PS2 version ready, and voice acting is really the thing. Because the port was not going to have voice acting. And so, as hype was building for 10, because, alongside this, they had already announced 10 and been hyping it, and it was like, 10's gonna have voice acting. And so if that's already in the public consciousness, and that's the thing that magazines are talking about and websites are talking about, is Final Fantasy X is going to have voice acting, then who's gonna pick up a PS2 port of a PS1 game that doesn't have voice acting when the Final Fantasy with voice acting is coming in a couple months?
Right.
So, yeah.
Huh. Well, it's interesting because despite not having a PC port for Final Fantasy IX until relatively recently,
late 2015, early 2016.
Yeah.
Has it even been a year? Something like that, like super, super duper recently, yeah.
Yeah, it was 2016.
2016, yeah, so like a year. Like so 16 years later, it finally got a PC port.
Right. And
a visual upgrade.
Yeah, I actually had to replay it on PC because the PS1 version that I had, in shipping, all the discs fell out of their casing container and got scratched, completely unplayable. Couldn't even get through the first cutscene.
Yeah, that's the place. That's actually the exact same place. So I had a previous copy of Final Fantasy IX, and that's the same place that it crapped out, was the You're playing the game, and you'd get to the first major cutscene, and it would crash every time. But so if you're playing the PC port, if you're playing the Steam version of Final Fantasy IX, all of the backgrounds, and a lot of people kind of like mark it down a little bit for this, is like, hey, the backgrounds look kind of low res by the standards of like everything else. That's because those are just the original assets that were planned for to be used to create the PS2 port and the PC port. And so you look at those, in the original. Yeah, that were used to generate the originals. And so it's like you look at that and look at those backgrounds by modern standards, and it's like, hey, they look a little rough by today's standards, but only a little. And think about what that meant for a PS1 game, and it's like, holy crap.
Yeah, the upgraded character models are actually super nice. I would recommend, if you can play it on PS1 and maybe also check out the PC version and or find a comparison on YouTube, because the differences are pretty astounding.
Yeah. That said, I have a very strong argument to make in favor of for even just educational purposes, taking a look at the PS1 version from through a technical lens at the various tricks that they use in order to keep performance up while still doing all of these really kind of graphically impressive things. My favorite example to pull up of what they did is, so they have all of these animated textures in the game, like smoke effects and things like that. And right. From a technical standpoint, those are just sprites that are overlaid over certain areas of the screen and maybe masked in the 3D space, but they're flat sprites. And if you're operating at a given resolution, like say 512 by 512, your sprite is going to be X size, too big for the PlayStation 1's RAM to handle and to play back properly. So the trick that they used to get the coverage that they need on the screen, to have a sprite be as big as they need it to be within the visual field while lowering its demand on the hardware, was all of them have an overlaid checkerboard pattern. So in terms of like active pixels, all of these sprites are actually half resolution. So that you see a lot of little tricks like that, and they made them. The checkerboard pattern is big enough that rather than just looking like a really grainy texture, like, and this is the thing, is rather than just having like every second pixel be inactive, it's a much larger checkerboard pattern, and so it creates an aesthetic.
Yeah. And like we mentioned earlier, this was the PlayStation 1 swan song, so they were really throwing every trick in the book that they had learned over the entire console's lifespan at this game. And it, honestly, I just kept screenshotting as I went along, because there are so many gorgeous moments, and that is, like, you don't hear people talking about gorgeous moments very often when you're talking about PlayStation 1 games, because and that aesthetic has not aged well.
It has not aged well, and this is the like really impressive thing, because even PS2 games, like, it would be a while before I think, 10 managed to do it to a pretty decent degree. But like, you look at a lot of PS2 games, and like, they're still like really rough at merging characters and environments in an aesthetically pleasing way. And in part, like, they had such a clear art design concept going into 9 that it wasn't just going to be like a PlayStation swan song. It was also going to be a love letter to Final Fantasies 1 through 6. And so tricks like using that checkerboard pattern, it gives the whole thing an aesthetic that is reminiscent of the pixel art from the 2D games, and they're using the same kind of blending techniques on the characters themselves. And unlike any other PlayStation 1 game, the characters in Final Fantasy IX really look like they are made of the same stuff as the world that they inhabit.
Yeah,
which actually bugged me at the time. At the time, when I first played it, I was actually really bothered by that because I had become so used to being able to tell, like, just at a glance, like, okay, Cloud and Tifa and Aerith, they look like they're made of just fundamentally different material than the environments around them, which has the side effect of making them pop really well. Like, they do stand out really well. And, like, chests stand out really well. Materia on the ground stands out really well because it's made of something different. It's textured different. The light engine works with it differently. And so when I got to 9, I was like, this is really difficult to read. And part of that is you're playing, in 2000, you're still playing on like a 14-inch screen, standard def screen. And that does interfere with it, but like it felt really too visually homogenous at the time. And I docked it points for that back then. And now I look back, I'm like, oh, they were ahead of their time.
Yeah.
When they were doing this, like visually, this is what was noise back in 2000. You go back and look at it, it's like, no, this is gorgeous. This is brilliant art design, what they've managed to do here.
So I'd just like us to go around real quick and talk about kind of what our experiences were like playing Final Fantasy IX. Jeremy, what about you? Like, how... Because I know you came to gaming a lot later than most people, so you kind of found this game long after it came out, right?
Yeah, I played this game in probably 2010 on the original PS3 via disc. I played several...
Oh, one of the backwards compatible ones?
Well, aren't all PS3s? Don't all PS3s play PS1 discs?
Yes.
No.
Well, the Slim... I think the PS3 Slim might... not
like the last iteration may not, but I'm pretty sure the first Slim might have. I don't know.
Well,
yeah, because I've got a second gen PS3 and I play via disc.
But I for sure played it on my fatty PS3, so I know that one works for well.
Okay, yeah,
for sure. And I'd played several other Final Fantasy games before this, and I enjoyed the franchise quite a bit. I always loved JRPGs. From the time I started gaming, which, as you say, Jack, was pretty late in my life. I kind of tried to go in order from the games that I could get, the games that were readily available. So I played like 4 on the DS, and then I eventually went back and played 6, but I didn't have access to that, so I played 7, then 8, then 9, and then 10, and I didn't care much to play an MMO, so I didn't play 11. And to me, 9 was just amazing. I can't specifically state what it was. I'm not very good with words, Dan, so I apologize. But the characters in particular, like, I love 7. I think 7 is great. I'm not a big fan of 8. I'll admit that. And 4, I really, really enjoyed. And 9 made me feel kind of like I was playing Final Fantasy 4 again, except with slightly updated graphics. And
in a good way?
Yeah, definitely in a good way.
Okay.
So that was my first experience. Well, 10 years after the game had come out. And, there were plenty of awesome, amazing, beautiful, gorgeous games to play on the PS3 in 2010. But I didn't really care. I was really getting into Final Fantasy at that time, JRPGs. So I actually bought the discs on eBay, and I made a point to not buy the bestseller series. I got a black label, because that was important. I'm kind of a collector.
Oh, I've got it. Mine's a greatest hits now.
Yeah.
My black label got all scratched.
That's a bummer.
Oh.
So I played it that way.
My greatest hits got all scratched.
That sucks both ways. Either way, like when I got mine, it was still like you could hear the discs shaking in the thing. Like I think that's just a flaw in the multi-disc PS1 cases. I don't know. It seems to happen to all of them.
It really does. It happened to my Final Fantasy VIII version as well.
But I probably put a good total between playing on disc and then I downloaded it via PSN a couple years later. I don't know, a good at least 200 hours into it. Again, I'm the guy that reads every line of dialogue. I search every area. I watch every cutscene. I mean, I do it all. So
well, and there's so much to dig into in Final Fantasy IX too.
Yeah, there is.
Like, I just did I finished it just last night actually for the very first time, and I pretty much only did mainline quest stuff, and it still took me like about 35 hours, maybe.
See, and I think that's pretty quick.
40 hours was like kind of what you considered standard for these games back then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like if 40 hours was a like kind of just straight for the ending, minimal, like just kind of enough grinding to keep the difficulty curve, but.
And see,
right.
I love the grind. I will grind until, like, it's not even necessary to grind. I just enjoy it.
So
well,
I have some bad news.
Okay.
We were talking about the jewel cases and them breaking, and so I decided to open mine up to see if any of the teeth were broken. And in fact, all the teeth are in place. However, disc 3 is missing.
What?
It's completely gone?
It's not in here.
What?
Okay.
Uh-oh. My disc 3 is missing.
Is it in your console?
No, because 2 is in my console right now.
Oh, no.
So, it's
how would that be gone?
It's 7 o'clock at night. Do you know where your disc 3 is?
I mean, I'm no genius, but I'm pretty sure you need that one to finish the game.
I think I need that one to finish the game. Yeah. I'm hoping I'm going to find it. I'm going to go do a audit of jewel cases a little later, and hopefully it's just in the wrong case in the box, or maybe it's rattling around loose at the bottom of a box, or maybe I'll be hitting eBay later.
It probably fell out like when you opened it, because there's that huge gap in the back of it. So when you open them, like discs can fall out of that gap. That's actually where a lot of them get ruined, is because you shut it and you don't know the disc is in there.
Oh, yep.
Yeah.
I've had that happen to me.
Yeah. But all of the gripping teeth, all of the little seedy gripping teeth are in place.
I mean, so that's like some good news, bad news situation.
Fine. Good news, bad news. Good news, the teeth are in place. Bad news, the disc is gone.
Interesting. So, Jack, your first experience was like literally a couple weeks ago when you first started playing, right?
Right. I was actually... I had no knowledge going into it. I was basically going into it blind because I hadn't really heard anything about the story, hadn't really heard... I'd seen pictures of the characters. I'd seen, like, Vivi is kind of the iconic black mage character.
Everybody's favorite sad boy.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody loves Vivi. How can you not love Vivi? Come on.
He won my heart when he and... How do you pronounce his name? Zidane?
Zidane, I think, is usually how I've said it. Zidane.
That's how I pronounce it. You can watch a million YouTube videos and hear every one of these characters pronounced different ways, but yeah.
Yeah.
I'm Team Zidane.
I was won over to Vivi. There's a scene like halfway through the game where they have kind of a bonding moment and Vivi's sad and Zidane's just like, here, I'm going to show you a old male ritual that'll help you feel better. And they just, off camera, they're just like peeing into a gigantic canyon.
Yep, that's good stuff.
And I was just like, this isn't a game. This is a real thing that is in a game, and I was not expecting it. Like, that's just kind of out of left field. Mm-hmm. It's so, but it's also at the same time oddly grounded in, like, that's a thing that I could see 16-year-old Jack or, you know, doing with his buddies, like on a road trip or something. I don't know.
Well, I think
it was weirdly relatable.
What's so great about the relationship between Zidane and Vivi is, like, Zidane's kind of in a lot of ways, he's kind of immature. He's kind of a joker. I mean, I like the guy. Reminds me a lot of myself. But there's that moment where Vivi realizes that he's probably one of the black mage dolls, and he's not really human, so to speak, or whatever you want to call it. And every time he brings that up, Zidane just, like, kind of deflects that conversation. He's like, come check out this thing over here. Look at me being an idiot. You're not that bad. And I think that's written very well. I can't put it into the best words, but, like, I come to respect Zidane for having those leadership abilities while not losing who he is as a person, because he is my favorite idiot ever. I love him so much.
And Dan, what was your first experience with Final Fantasy IX?
So I played it basically at release. Like, maybe a little after, like the summer after. So like 2001. So it was current. It was current at the time, and so I get what am I trying to say here? What's the question?
What was your experience playing it for the first time? Like, what's your history with Final Fantasy IX? What's your relationship to it?
Okay, so after it came out, so I played it largely like the spring summer after it came out, and I really got into it. So, okay, the backstory here is that my younger brother was a fiend for Final Fantasy VIII. Like,
really?
He mastered that game to like the depths to which it can be mastered. Like, he knew where everything was. He knew exactly where you needed to go to draw exactly the spells you needed to maximize your stats, to synthesize your weapons to their highest whatever. Like, he knew things about systems in that game that I didn't even know those systems existed. I did not actually make it very far through Final Fantasy VIII back when it came out, largely because either my brother was like the one who was always like hogging it, or and also it didn't grab me. I made it through, I think, the first disc, and then was just kind of like, whatever. I'm too cool for this. And for whatever reason, like, I think just like as a sibling rivalry kind of pride, I was like, no, Final Fantasy IX is going to be mine. Like, I am going to wreck this game. And so I had the strategy guide, which I'm gonna write a note, because we need to come back. We need to talk about that strategy guide.
Yeah, we do actually.
So I had the strategy guide, and I sat, and I did not actually get to the point where I'd say I like mastered the game, but I spent a lot of really focused time playing it. Basically, like a lot of my free time for a couple months, playing through it. And I think my original save file back in the day probably had something like 130 hours on it or whatever, and I had almost collected like all the cards. And yeah, like when I got around to finally like finishing the story fights, like the final boss, I blew away in 3-4 turns, because I was so ridiculously overleveled. Like, the final boss, if you're pushing through, normally you're gonna get to the final boss around level 50, and the boss is like, I think, 61. So there's a lot of space in there for you to there's a lot of space above that between 61 and the level cap of 99. So if your characters are all sitting at 99, the challenge is let's just say diminished. So that was kind of my experience with 9. And now the thing that I found kind of most interesting about it is I did not actually get it at the time. I felt really let down by the resolution of the story, and I found that in the last disc and a half, I had really been kind of just like checking out in a lot of ways. Like I did not get what they were doing narratively with the story of the game. The plot didn't make a whole lot of sense, and at the time, I think this was it. I mean, I was a teenager, so plot is sort of your main thing to really grab on. Like theme isn't the thing that you really look for in a video game in particular. Like you're looking, it's like, no, what's the story? What's the plot? Who's the bad guy and what threat do they pose? And what's the big sacrificial moment for my characters? And like you're thinking in very broad terms, broad emotional terms.
Yeah.
And so I didn't get Final Fantasy IX at the time, and it wasn't until I revisited it like a decade later in like 2010, actually it was, I think 2009 was the first time I went back to actually then like revisit Final Fantasy IX, and it was at that time that I made it to kind of the midpoint of the game when you're finally picking up the last of the characters. And it was like, oh, I get it now. I see what they're trying to do. I see where the story actually is.
Yeah. And how did you interpret that story? Like, what can you give a we'll try and keep it a brief synopsis. I know there's
okay, so
there's a lot of stuff going on in this game.
And now here's where and it gets complicated because there's really two stories running in parallel. Like there's the plot of the game, which is kind of nonsense in a lot of ways, and then there's the story of the game, which is really all of, like it's heavily character driven. Mm-hmm. In a way that I think even today, like most video games are not this character driven. They are not this internal. And that's part of, I think, that's another reason why I think it kind of drifted out of consciousness so quickly, is because the plot is kind of nonsense, and it really is kind of this. It is very much a subtle, slow burn that doesn't have a whole lot of like big shiny moments. It doesn't have that Sephiroth killing Eris moment that people are kind of like craving. It doesn't have that mimetic moment. Because instead, it's the story is ultimately all about these individual characters and their flaws. Like they're singular, like each of them has a singular personality flaw that they learn to cope with.
I think you're right to an extent that the plot is nonsense, but it's not bad nonsense.
It's not bad nonsense. No, I mean, it is kind of like routine video game nonsense. When you step back, but it's treated very seriously in kind of a way that like it's a low impact sort of nonsense. Like, and this is the thing, like it doesn't reach the levels of absurdity that nanomachines. But it's also it also doesn't get bad enough. Like it does neither. It doesn't hit these these absurd upper peaks of like super high emotional intensity, nor does it get just like completely bug nuts where people just remember it forever. Like I just want to talk about like the character motivations or these character flaws, and just one of the things that I want to highlight about that while it's still fresh is that. The kind of flaws that we're talking about, like they're not broad, like they're really kind of like heavy stuff. Like Vivi, we've touched on this. Like his thing that he's dealing with is like existential dread. His fundamental existence as a conscious being, and it's like that's heavy.
Piggybacking off of that slightly. I love how the visuals of this game help make all of this stuff palatable, because all these characters are dealing with things that are really, really traumatizing and like threatening their very
perception
ability
of
to cope with.
Yeah.
Like just fun. Like we're dealing with people who've had their entire race be victims of genocide.
Mm-hmm.
We are dealing with people who are supposed to be, in control, having all of that control ripped away from them. We're dealing with,
people
like
learning
Vivi,
that their entire existence is a lie.
Coping with the possibility that they might not even really be a person.
Yeah. One of the characters, Zidane, has to deal with the fact that he is the beneficiary of genocide.
Yeah, and so one of the complaints I heard prior to starting my playthrough of this game was that there are some people out there who don't like that there is kind of this more cartoonish aesthetic when, Final Fantasy 7 and 8 were kind of darker.
Yeah.
Like, Final Fantasy 9 isn't visually dark. It's much more. It's much brighter. It draws on kind of the brightness of the earlier entries.
There's a lot more
the Final
blues
Fantasy
and
series.
oranges, and a lot less grays and browns.
Yeah, and not just from a color perspective, but also the character models themselves,
it's going back
are
to the
exaggerated,
super deformed anime style.
You
got a lot more like chibi elements in there, and
the way I thought of it in my head is it's kind of like Dragon Quest visuals, but with a harder fantasy edge, I guess, if that makes any sense to people listening.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like the more friendly and inviting art style makes all of this terrible stuff a lot. It contrasts very nicely.
Yeah, it's deceptive in a way, like in a good way. I think it's deceptive. It's charming and it lures you in, and then next thing you know, you're contemplating the nature of consciousness.
Exactly, and I think that subtle deceptiveness is kind of what makes Final Fantasy IX really interesting to me, just to talk about, because that extends. Like, we can come back to characters in a second, but I just noticed how, even because I know that part of the design of this game was intentionally to draw upon the tropes of the Final Fantasy series and kind of make callbacks to them.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of stuff in this game that very subtly subverts your expectations of what a fantasy RPG is supposed to be. Like, one example I'll give is in the middle of the game, you have to collect. The game sets it up that you are going to have to go collect these 4 mirrors and place them at various points around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And in a traditional JRPG, what would then happen would then be like a 20-hour segment where you're going around to each of these
You go to the
shrines.
Earth dungeon and you get you fight the Earth boss, and then you get the mirror of Earth, and you take the Earth mirror to the Earth shrine, and you place the Earth mirror on the Earth shrine, and then the Earth Esper shows up, and you prove your worthiness to the Earth Esper, and then the Earth Esper haunts the Earth mirror at the Earth shrine. And then you head to the air shrine, or the air dungeon. Yeah.
And instead of that, which is, at this point, in 2000, the RPG tropes are pretty well established in video games. So I'm 100% sure if I had played it when it came out, that's what I would be expecting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually what I was expecting when I played it recently. And instead, what happens is a charmingly exciting sequence where they're just like, nah, screw that. We're all going to split up into twos, and we're going to drop you all off into various parts of the world, and we're going to do it all at the same time.
We're going to just airdrop this. Yeah.
And it's great. It's a very charming sequence, and it leads to a unique boss encounter where you just fight the one boss, and all the other duos of characters have unique interactions with each other, and it gives the side characters a chance to shine.
Mm-hmm.
And then you just have this one unique boss encounter, and it's very it's very subversive in a non. It's not trying to draw attention to itself in that. It's just completely not what you would expect to happen in a situation like that.
And there are a lot of subtle things like that scattered throughout the game, in a really fun way, in a way that rewards familiarity with the genre as a whole, and particularly familiarity with like the specifics of Final Fantasies 1 through 6.
And sorry, I kind of got us off track there, but you were talking about the characters.
I was talking about the characters, and I think actually we should try as best we can to actually like do a synopsis of the plot.
And that's coming up right after this intermission. Part 1 was basically really interesting, digging into the history of Final Fantasy IX and a little bit more about our guest on the show this week. Next, we kind of get more into the nitty-gritty details of Final Fantasy IX and kind of our takes on it. And also, Jeremy has to take off kind of in the middle of this episode, so you'll hear him in Part 2 peter out a little bit, and then he'll come back at the end with kind of his take, but he had to leave in the middle of the show, unfortunately, and I hope you stick around for Part 2 after the music. Just a quick word on the ending music on this show. There are so many great tracks that people have come to love about Final Fantasy IX. We didn't really have a lot of time on the show to talk about music. Several times throughout our recording session, we mentioned how much there is to talk about in Final Fantasy IX. The soundtrack is just very touching on a very primal level. It was still kind of at the end of the period where people made video game music that was catchy and looped really, really well. And now it's a little bit more oriented towards ambiance and mood music, and rather than having a catchy, memorable tune. So yeah, please stick around and listen on in Part 2.